what are the purposes of these three letters? Of course, they're different in some ways, aren't they? But to alert the church to the necessity of fighting growing heresy. So there's a false teaching going on. Let me say this and then I'll make another comment. Secondly, to establish the church and its leaders in both teaching and behavior so that the church would function appropriately as the pillar and support of the truth. And that's what he says. The church is the pillar and support of the truth in 1 Timothy 3:14 and 15. You know, it is natural that the pastoral epistles are a little bit different because Paul recognizes that his life is coming to an end. And when your life's coming to an end, you know, you begin to think about the next generation. You know, I'm at the age where I think about my grandkids, you know, and I think about the gospel in their generation. And, of course, who's going to strengthen them? Not me. I mean, maybe I'll help a little bit, but people like you, right? You're going to strengthen and help them as the baton of faith is passed on. And that's what Paul is thinking. Now, another comment I want to make. Of course, some Protestants are nervous about saying the church is the pillar and support of the truth. To them, that sounds very Catholic. It's early Catholic. There it is. Oh, no, watch out. So, is there a problem there? I don't have time to defend this in detail, right? As there's so much we say in here. But, of course, the gospel creates the church, doesn't it? It's the Word of God that creates and forms the church. And I think there's no doubt about that, but I'm not giving you that evidence. But it's also true, it's not contradictory, is it, to say that the church also supports the gospel. There's a sense in which that's true as well. We don't want to go to the other extreme, do we? We don't want to say that anything that even smells of Catholicism, then it's bad, because I'm not a Catholic in any way, you know. But there are elements of truth in Catholic teaching, right? And they're not right that finally the church is the foundation of the gospel. I don't think they're right there. But it is right to say that the church functions as a pillar and support of the truth. Finally, it's the Word that preserves the church, but the church plays a role, a very vital role. Don't you forget it, right? In your ministries. Don't you forget that. Because God has entrusted us as believers in Jesus Christ as playing a role in undergirding and supporting and advancing the gospel. Thirdly, to prepare his helpers and the church for the necessity of passing the truth down to a new generation and to encourage them to endure suffering in the process. So if you look at what is different in 2 Timothy? How does 2 Timothy, if I were to ask you this question, and maybe I will someday, what is different in 2 Timothy compared to 1 Timothy and Titus? Well, it's the last of Paul's letters. It's after he's been arrested again, right? He's in prison when he's writing 2 Timothy. And there's an emphasis in this letter, therefore, not surprisingly, there's an emphasis on suffering in this letter, isn't there? That you need to pass down the truth to the new generation as you suffer, because this is really Paul's last swan song, right? His last song before he goes, his last instructions. So that's interesting to observe, particularly. You think of that when you read 2 Timothy. Okay, this is Paul's last letter. He's in prison. After this, he's going to be put to death. Almost certainly, Paul died with a Roman sword, since he was a Roman citizen. So they would have cut off his head. And he's encouraging the church to be faithful as that's happening. And then fourthly, Titus may reflect a more primitive situation, maybe that's not the best word, than 1 Timothy. By which I mean, I already alluded to this. So I've said something about 2 Timothy. How do we distinguish between 1 Timothy and Titus? Those letters, I'm sure you've noticed this, they have a lot of overlap, don't they? They have a lot of overlap. Titus is briefer. But remember that Titus, what we have in Titus is a new church plant, right, in Crete. In Ephesus, 1 Timothy was written to Ephesus, you have an established church. So what we see in Titus may be a church that's a little bit more rough-hewn, a little more less advanced. So I was going to say this later, but I think I'll say it now. Isn't it interesting when it comes to qualification of elders, in 1 Timothy he says you can't be a new convert. But he doesn't say that in Titus. Why not? Everybody's a new convert. They couldn't have any leaders. So you get a sense, don't you? There's some flexibility in those requirements. Not in terms of character, right? He doesn't say, well, it's fine in Titus. It's okay to have a thief as one of your elders. He doesn't say that, does he? Go ahead of having an adulterer. You're new Christians. No, he doesn't say that, does he? But he does recognize, no, you can't require somebody to be a Christian for a long time. Because nobody's been a Christian a long time. All right, then references to false teaching in the pastorals. So I just want to hit on some of these. So these letters are imbued by the notion that people are teaching some wrong things. 1 Timothy 1:3, charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine. So right after the greeting, boom, talks about the false teachers. He says they teach contrary to sound doctrine. He actually says in chapter 1, they want to teach the law, but they don't know how to use it. So these false teachers are leading people astray. Hymenaeus and Alexander, males, I just put males there because of our previous discussion, have rejected the faith in a good conscience. They've made shipwreck of the faith, and Paul has placed them under church discipline. Chapter 5, verse 15, some have already strayed after Satan. Chapter 6, verse 10, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. So we have people who are departing, right? They profess what is falsely called knowledge. 2 Timothy 2:16 through 18. But avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus, there's that name again, right? And Philetus, who have swerved from the truth of the gospel, saying that the resurrection has already happened. So, over-realized eschatology. The resurrection has already occurred. They say the resurrection has already occurred. Perhaps they said the only resurrection that happens is spiritual. Who knows? They're upsetting the faith of some. So that word for upsetting is the same word that's used for when Jesus turns over the tables. They're ruining the faith of some. So some people who are Christians, right? Their faith was destroyed by these people. So it's not just, they're wacko. They think the resurrection's already happened, but nobody's believing this. No, people are following them, and people are renouncing the faith. They're upsetting, turning over, destroying the faith of some through what they're saying. Well, I hope we get back to that verse, because it's very interesting to see what Paul says next. So, this is really strange stuff, right? I have met a person have I talked about him? I can't remember, but who believes, when I was at Bethlehem, Minnesota, he believed that the resurrection had already taken place. And I said to him, well, then we're in the new creation. We're in heaven. And he said, yes. Like, okay, we're in heaven. Wow, heaven is not that great. I was expecting a little bit more. But that's what he believed. And he was a heretic. You know what his defense was? I said, Paul says this is wrong in 2 Timothy. And he goes, well, Paul wrote that in the 60s, and Jesus came back in AD 70. So he was a preterist, an absolute preterist, if you've heard of those people. So I said, so Paul wrote that for 6 years? He wrote it like 64, 65? So the church needed that for 6 years of their life, and then they didn't need it anymore? Pretty strange idea. Well, there's a lot of other problems with that, right? Anyway, welcome to heaven. I've always thought my class is kind of heavenly. So, I mean, what else would people want to do in heaven besides go to my class? I mean, I don't know. So, no comments, please, or questions. But Titus 1, 10 and 11, for there are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party. They must be silenced, since they are upsetting, there it is again, upsetting whole families by teaching for shameful gain, for money, right, what they ought not to teach. Titus 1:14, they devote themselves to Jewish myths and commands of people who turn away from the truth. They profess to know God, Titus 1:16, but they deny Him by their works. They're detestable, disobedient, unfit for any good work. Titus 3:9, but avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. And then look at 1 Timothy 1:4, devoted to myths, genealogies, and speculations. Verse 6, vain discussion. So, this is a very mysterious thing. They were really into genealogies and these myths, but we don't know anything more about this. Why were they into genealogies? Why was that attractive to them? What role did that play in the false teaching? Right? I've never met a false teacher today that's into genealogies. Have you? Maybe there are some, but I've never met one. And so, what was going on? Well, the thing is, Paul doesn't really explain it for us. He just rips them, really. He just says, this is silly. This is trivial. Sometimes when a false teaching arises, Paul explains in detail why it's wrong, right, Galatians? But in the pastorals, he doesn't do that so much. By the way, that's why some people think it's not by Paul. But we already agreed they're wrong on that, right? He doesn't explain so much why they're wrong. He just says, basically, it's silly. It's trivial. It's beside the point. But I think there's a pastoral word for us there. We need, as pastors and teachers and Christians, talking to other Christians, right? You're not all going to be pastors. We need wisdom. Sometimes you should explain to someone why they're wrong. Sometimes you should ignore it, right? Isn't that the pattern Paul gives? Sometimes it's not worth your breath. And you don't want to go down that labyrinth with them, right? So it takes wisdom to know when to do that. But I think the more experience we have, the more we'll know when to do that. And that's what Paul does here. He doesn't, why don't we know about their teaching? Paul doesn't tell us. Because he says, this stuff's not even worth talking about. So, yeah, there are some things not worth debating, in other words. Then I have this section on teaching and preaching in the pastoral epistles. Lots of things there. You can look at that. Boy, look at it. It's just a ton, isn't it? It's so important. Then elders, overseers, and pastors. Right? We see, I say the terms elder and overseer. Bishop is another word for overseer. Are you same word, just an English translation, are used in a way that indicates that they overlap in meaning in the New Testament. Ben Merkel, one of our graduates who teaches at Southeastern, he wrote his doctoral dissertation on that, and it's published, arguing that they're this. And he's teaching, by the way, he's teaching a class on the pastoral epistles in Greek this summer, if you're interested in that. And Ben's a very, very good teacher, and it'll be a great class. Also, the word pastor is another way of describing this same office. Here, I just want to show you that a little bit. Acts 20, the elders, Paul summons the elders of the church of Ephesus, and he tells them to shepherd, that's a verb, but that's the word pastor, right? Pastor the flock, in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. So you see in that very passage, verse 17, he calls them elders. Verse 28, he calls them overseers, and as overseers, they're to pastor and shepherd the flock. Titus 1:5, he says you are to appoint elders in every church. And then he says, for an overseer. He glides from elder to overseer, elders designating status, overseer function. He glides from elder to overseer. Again, showing they're the same office. 1 Peter 5, I exhort the elders, Peter says, as a fellow elder, to shepherd the flock. There's our word pastor again, right? Shepherd the flock, exercising oversight. And there's our word for oversee, bishop, oversee. It's a participle there, but it's the same word. If some of you know Greek, episkopao, right? Episkopos for overseer. And if you know the Greek, you know that epi means over, and skopos means over, to look over, to oversee. So the etymology of the word actually is what the word means. You know, Carson warns us in exegetical fallacies that etymologies can be wrong, and they can be, but sometimes they're right, you know, and this time they are. Praise the Lord. So, what about qualifications? So I'm just jumping in, and then we'll look at some passages, but I wanted to look at this. What are the qualifications for elders in 1 Timothy and Titus? So, this is important, right? So many of you are already elders or have been elders and overseers or will be, and all of you are members of churches in which elders and overseers are appointed or selected. Of course, I'm a Congregationalist. I think the congregation should do that, but not everybody agrees with that, and we just pray for them. And so the fundamental requirement is that elders should be above reproach. These lists are not exhaustive, are they? They're not intended to be exhaustive. So that does not mean sinless, does it? Then nobody could be an elder or an overseer. It means that they're above reproach, that they have a good reputation in the church and in the community. So that's the fundamental requirement in both lists. Many of the requirements are very, we'll come back to husband and one wife, but, you're to be sober-minded. You're to be self-controlled. You're to be respectable. You're to be hospitable. We'll skip one. You're not to be a drunkard. You're not to be violent, but gentle. You're not to be quarrelsome. Not a lover of money. And you see, lastly, that not a recent convert in that Timothy list. So, these are representative qualities. Now, just a couple comments about this. Appointing an elder, an overseer, it's a serious task. But this requirement is a requirement that is expected to be fulfilled by all Christians, right? This is something we're all to attain to. I mean, right, you're not all to be a husband of one wife, I know, but depending on your gender or calling. Well, I'll come back to that. This list can be overinterpreted and underinterpreted. It can be overinterpreted. Sometimes I've experienced that at Clifton. We ask somebody, do you fit these qualities? They're really the same qualities for a deacon, essentially, except for a couple things I'll mention. Do you fulfill these requirements? And oh no, I'm a failure. I'm a terrible sinner. And, my response is always, I know that. We all know that. We talk about it as elders all the time. No, that's not what I say. I'm kidding. So, of course, we're all sinners. But look at, not a drunkard. Hello? That's pretty obvious, you know. We're not going to pick a person who's an alcoholic, constantly drinking, you know, as one of our elders. That's not that remarkable, is it? That's pretty basic and fundamental. So you can over-interpret the list, right? You can over-interpret it. Of course, you could under-interpret it if you're too casual. But I think maybe everybody in this room that you could pass this test, right? And many have come to us, and I think rightly, they look at the list and say, you know, I struggle with sin, but yeah, by God's grace, I fulfill all these requirements. Yeah, and we ask them some questions, you know. But yes, this is something that's expected of every Christian. This isn't, now, who are the heroes in your congregation? Who are the just spiritual giants? Not necessarily, you see. Of course, not everybody in the congregation necessarily does fulfill these requirements, but that's what's called for. So by over-interpreting as well, I haven't experienced this so much lately, but it depends on where you come from. I've experienced congregations who say, well, you can't be if you're not married. It says husband and one wife. You know, reading this list very literalistically, very woodenly. Oh, you don't have kids? Sorry. You know, you're out. So, you know, there goes Jesus as an elder. And Paul, you know. So they wouldn't do, right? I think that's a wrong approach to reading these lists so sort of woodenly. The intentions are good, aren't they? They want to do God's will. Praise God for that. Their intentions are good, but I don't think they're reading the list rightly. Then a couple of controversial things. Husband and one wife. Well, no. Two things that are said about elders, and I already said this, but I just want you to see this. Two things that are said about elders that aren't said about deacons and overseers. Chapter 3, verse 2, they're to be able to teach. Titus is very interesting, right? 1:9 is quite long. They must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine. Now, that not every Christian can do, right? So elders are to have a particular ability to instruct in sound doctrine, and also to rebuke those who contradict it. So somebody may know what sound doctrine is, but they're not gifted at explaining why someone else has gone astray. That person probably shouldn't be an elder, you see? Because elders have a particular calling to encourage in sound doctrine and to correct those who have gone astray. So that emphasis on teaching, not required of deacons, and also chapter 3, verse 5, they're to manage their own household well because they care for God's church, or they're to be, Titus 1:7, God's steward, God's manager. So a leadership quality in the elders and overseers. So those two things stand out. Then, the two controversial things. One husband and one wife. What does that mean? Good Christians have disagreed with this all through history. Some have thought it meant, in the very early church, if your wife died, that you shouldn't remarry. Because if you remarried, then you couldn't be an elder. I don't agree with that view because I think Scripture clearly says that if your wife dies, you can remarry. But that was a very popular view in the early church. Others say it prohibits polygamy. It prohibits polygamy. You can't have more than one wife. I think it does prohibit polygamy. I think that's true. I just got a question about this the other day from someone. What would I say to someone in a polygamous situation when they become a Christian? I would argue that they ought not to divorce some of their wives and end up with only one, because they're going to put their other wives at a great disadvantage financially, and how are they going to live? And I think that's abandoning them. I don't think it was originally the right thing to marry more than one wife, but if they already have, they should stay married and be a faithful husband. But I wouldn't appoint that person to be an elder, right? So I think they didn't make a good decision at the beginning. And that's a difficult issue, and some Christians disagree with that, but I think that's clearly the right thing to do, to stay faithful to the wives you have, at the beginning. But I don't actually think Paul has polygamy fundamentally in mind, because there's a parallel in 1 Timothy 5:9 about the widows. And it says there, it's the very same phrase, but reverse, she's to be the wife of one husband. Did I say that right? Husband of one wife. Yeah, wife of one husband, right. So there was no such thing in the Greco-Roman world as polyandry, right? There was no such thing as a wife having many husbands. So are you with me? 1 Timothy 5:9? It's the very same phrase. Husband of one wife, 1 Timothy 5:9, I think that's the right reference. Wife of one husband for those who are to be appointed as widows. Well, I think the phrases ought to be interpreted similarly. And so yes, I think polygamy rules you out, but some people say, well, that's what Paul was especially thinking of. I don't think that's what he was especially thinking of because of the parallel phrase. So what was he thinking of? Well, many people say, and this could definitely be right, and probably many of you in this room believe this, that it means you can't be divorced and remarried. I don't hold that view right now, but I have. And that view has a long lineage of interpretation. So if you've been divorced and remarried, then you're prohibited from being an elder, because there's a higher standard for elders. Makes good sense. And it wraps into how you understand the teaching on divorce and remarriage, right? So that's a complex matter. But maybe I'll just say a couple things why I don't hold that view. I think what he's saying is that you are to be a faithful husband, 1 Timothy 3:2, or a faithful wife, 1 Timothy 5:9. So faithful enough in your marriage that you have a good reputation in the church and in the community for your marriage. So that your track record is long enough and significant enough that people respect your relationship and your faithfulness as a husband in this case. I think that makes sense for a number of reasons. People who perhaps got divorced and remarried before they were Christians. I don't think they're eliminated from serving as a pastor. I had a student here. I won't say his name, but when he got married, the day he got married, he told me the story himself. The day he got married, his wife met an old friend at the wedding, and her friend was part of Wicca, and they reestablished their relationship together on the wedding day. Strange as it sounds, and his wife went in that direction, became part of Wicca, and then she had many, many affairs, because she obviously fell far away from the things of God. And he ended up divorcing her, understandably. And 5-10 years later, he got married. And 10 years after that, he's a pastor now. He's a pastor in a church. And I have no problem with that. I think he is well qualified to be a pastor. Exegetically, I think that also fits with the passage on widows. I don't think Paul is saying you can't put a widow on the list to receive financial support if she's ever been divorced or remarried. I think he's looking for character qualities, you see. I think he's looking for character qualities and saying, has this woman served the church and her family in a way that it's evident that she's a Christian? One more thing I'd say about that, we can't. It's a survey class. We can't spend forever on it. When Paul says you can't be a drunkard, I don't interpret that to mean you can have never gotten drunk. If that's what it means, I couldn't be a pastor. I got drunk before I was saved a number of times, and I don't know of anybody who interprets it that way. I think what Paul means is you can't have a lifestyle. You have now established yourself to be without reproach regarding alcohol, drugs, whatever it is. And I think the same applies to marriage. So I think actually people are a little bit inconsistent, you see, when they say, oh, drunkard, yeah, as long as you're okay now. But I don't think they do the same thing when they come to the marriage clause. At least that's my reading. You make up your own mind. Then when he says, he talks about children. In Titus, children who are faithful and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. That could be read children who are believers. And again, some people say, if your children fall away, then you can't be an elder or an overseer. But if your children are following the Lord, then you can be. But I think that means, I don't agree with that interpretation. I don't think it's requiring that children must be believers. I actually know a number of pastors who couldn't serve as pastors if that were true. Some very prominent pastors indeed. I think what Paul has in mind, we have to consider the culture of that day where children stayed in the home, 12, 13 years. And in those years, it's clear whether children are faithfully under the authority of their parents. I was in a church in Minnesota where we had a lot of staff, so I can say this just really generally, but there was one staff member's kid who was a terror, and his name would send fear and trembling into everyone's hearts when they thought of watching him. So it wasn't an accident. I'm not trying to be too simplistic here. But I'm just trying to give an illustration. It wasn't an accident that this pastor ended up being in a 7-year affair. Things were wrong at home at a number of levels. A lot of things were going on. I know some kids are harder than others and all that, but there's a kind of obedience that younger children have to their parents that's evident. We're not talking about perfection, are we? I mean, we all recognize that. Children struggle and so forth and so on. We're just talking about kids that are generally well-behaved and respectful of parents. I don't think Paul has in mind as children grow older and begin to make their own decisions apart from a family. And I don't think there's any guarantee when you read all of biblical revelation, I don't think there's a guarantee that such children will be saved. They have their own choices to make, their own decisions to make, so that they'd received a good foundation. And I think in many, many cases, we ought to be optimistic. I was very optimistic as a parent about our kids. We ought to be optimistic our kids will be saved under good, faithful teaching. But I don't think there's a guarantee in that regard. So that's my read on that. I think the translation here is good, that the children are to be faithful, and that, so, here, there's some more on the list here, but when I know a pastor whose kid wasn't following the Lord, and he said, if you want to remove me, remove me. But I think the elders wisely said, no, we're not going to remove you. It's, he's making his own decision. And then the qualifications for deacons and deaconesses, very, very similar qualifications. The qualifications really aren't different, right? The character qualifications are the same. It's just a matter of a different office. Now, I do believe, again, so many controversial things. I believe in female deacons, 1 Timothy 3:11. The ESV says they're wives. Doesn't say, but I would translate that women. Likewise, and I think that refers to women deacons. I think women can serve as deacons because deacons don't teach or exercise authority. It's a service role. The word there, remember the Greek word gunaikos means wives or women. So that's a translation, that's an interpretation, isn't it? The word there, their wives, is not there in the Greek. the ESV added it, their wives. I think that's one of the arguments why he's not talking about the wives. It's the same kind of qualifications, very, very brief. Another argument for women deacons is if these are the wives of the deacons. Tell me why he wouldn't tell us what's required of the wives of the elders who exercise authority in the church. I mean, how strange. You only require this of the deacons' wives, but not the elders? That seems like a very strange thing indeed. So, I have some other reasons. I think the women served as deacons in the early church. Yes. Many Southern Baptist churches don't have elders or pastors, and the deacons function as elders. Yes, in that case, I wouldn't have female deacons, right? And most Southern Baptist churches, that's the way they function. Then in that case, you want to slowly bring them to the place where they have elders and deacons. But you have to go slow. And it may not happen in your ministry. I was with John Piper in Minnesota. The 11th year of his ministry, the 11th year, he got elders. So you got to know your people. And maybe that's for the next person. You don't go in the first year or two and say that. I mean, maybe they're open to it, but be wise, right? Don't be in such a big hurry if they're not ready for it.